Hello, everyone, and welcome back to DV Trends. Today, we're going to be talking all about alternative business models for archaeology. I'm Lisa, and I am the founder and co-CEO of DEG Ventures, and today I'm here as the host for this very important conversation. So those of you who know DV know that we launched 10 years ago with an alternative business model that included crowdfunding as a core part of our community building ethos. Since then, we've continued to experiment with expanding and contracting around that, employing hybrid experiences, digital experience, and other kinds of engagement, and combining that with both commercial and social priorities around our operations. We wanted to have this business model conversations because we spend a lot of time in wider culture sector and global social entrepreneurship type places. And there are many great ideas and practical models out there that are helping businesses balance commercial success with social outcomes. And archaeology, in the professional sense, is kind of leaving that potential on the table. We seem to at least all be able to agree and have an accepted understanding that the current commercial archaeology model isn't really helping reach stability as a sector, and the constant boom and bust affects our ability to operate as a profession and a field of study. Everything from a lack of current capacity to recruitment into the sector and take up of degrees at university really can be traced back to the business model. At the same time, we know that millions of people are fascinated by archaeology. So why isn't that really translating into a much stronger sector? Why aren't we connecting with our audiences and sort of folding them into our strengths in a meaningful way, as well as a financially positive way? We thought it would be really useful to share some of the wider perspectives out there with other archaeologists to see if we might help to enable further sector interest in exploring some of those options. And in order to do that today, we have some superb panelists who will help us unpick it, followed by a Q&A at the end of the session. Should also mention that we will follow up the event with an email containing the recording, as well as links to everything that's going to be mentioned today during the conversation. I'm going to move now on to the introduction. So with me today are three fantastic guests. First, we have Anna Dinnan from the Young Foundation. For those of you who haven't heard of it, the Young Foundation supports locally led action and works collaboratively with communities to improve lives, address shared challenges, and drive social change for stronger communities and a fairer future. Anna is one of the key facilitators for the NLHF's Heritage Innovation Fund, and she has a wealth of experience in organizational development, including governance, culture, values, as well as strategy and business planning, including new venture design and business modeling. So she's bringing a lot to the table today. Also joining us is Sharath Jeevan, who is a globally recognized authority on leadership at inflection moments and is an acclaimed advisor, speaker, and author supporting leaders and organizations to future-proof success. He supports a wide range of organizations, including B Corp, Space Hive, and Harvard University, just to name a few, to safely navigate their big inflection moments through an innovative guided journey process, which is also very relevant to today's discussion. And then finally, today we have DV's very own Dr. Brendan Wilkins, who co-founded DV after 20 plus years in the commercial archaeology sector. And so in addition to oversight of DV's archaeological fieldwork program, Brendan also leads our innovation function, primarily across the Deep Time Project, which is a mass participation digital citizen science project stretching across both natural and historic environment, landscape level analysis. Brendan is also a member of the NLHF's Heritage Innovation Fund's first ever cohort, and is now very excitingly partnering with Nesta and the Future Narratives Lab across DV's contribution to that. So before we jump in, I will also just mention that in the chat, we have some housekeeping notes, so please do have a look at that. And without further ado, let's dive in with the first question. Why do we, as archaeologists, as well as the heritage and wider culture sector, need to think about business and governance models? What's currently not working and why? And we're hoping, Anna, that you will take a first stab at this question.
Great, thank you. I mean, so much going on in this sort of space. Like, I was recently reading the Unleashing Creativity report, which is about fixing the finance gap in the creative industry section. There was a talk about the difference between sunrise and sunset organizations. I thought, God, I would definitely want to be in the camp of the sunrise organizations. And I think there are three things that are particularly true that I see across the wider cultural sector, which is where I do a lot of my work, which would be about the workforce and the changing patterns of need, motivation, of different of the staff, of like multi-generational workplaces, all of those different kind of factors coming together. I think our relationship to money has changed massively. So in the cultural sector, people are experimenting all the time with different kind of models of like pay what you can, or changing from a fixed fee to a subscription model. We're doing all our digital accounting online. There's so many changes in that sort of sphere. I think finally we're like literally scratching the surface of the organizational change that needs to come through environmental responsibility and the kind of costs and the labor associated with being more responsible. And that is definitely going to play through our business models in a major way. And many people are already starting to address that, but I think we've got a really long way to go in that space.
Did you see the costs and labor involved in being more responsible?
Well, I think it's not just the costs and labor. It's actually like the wiring of the processes. So even if you take something like waste, or how do we deal with waste, there are so many different ways in which you can think about that in your organization. I work with a lot of venues, but it applies not just to venues and people, with visitors essentially, but also to people organizing services or supplying services. So this plays through, and it affects absolutely everything that we're trying to do. Like if you're trying to go on the circular economy kind of route and reinvest all of your resource back into your business, that's a fundamental driver for business model change as well. And I think people are starting to get imaginative about that. But there's a lot of opportunity and potential to go further there.
That's really interesting, and we'll dive a little bit deeper into that, I hope, with further questions. But Shareth, did you also want to have a stab at this?
Yeah, so one of the first, great to be on the discussion, and I've really obviously been really enjoying working with the Living Ventures team, and over the last few months we've been thinking about some of these questions very practically. But one of my first ever career experiences was with a failed.com company that I sort of co-founded, an early Facebook, and I realized very quickly how important getting business models was right. We had to close the company down, we'd raise some VC funding, etc. And I think one of the things that the lessons that it really taught me was that to really separate two things. One is what I would call value creation. What value are we creating overall for the world and for who? The second part is value capture. How do we capture that value in a fair way that also allows other stakeholders to benefit, and communities also have social value created as well in the process? And what I've come to learn from our work together in the world of archaeology is that the sort of question of value creation, archaeology for archaeology's own sake, seems to be a very challenging space right now, right? The market is potentially shrinking, there's more cost pressure. I think several providers have had to leave the sector over the past year around that. So I think if I was in archaeology now and sitting in these shoes, my challenge would be, archaeology for what? What is the value we're going to try and create for society more widely, that we can really point to and make the beginnings of a business model around? Are we helping, with our natural heritage, our historical one? Who's benefiting? What levels is that benefit creating? I think if we can really distill that very clearly, that normally starts with thinking about the world differently and looking at it with fresh eyes and saying, how do we see the different world differently from others? Where do we think there are opportunities to really create new sources of social and economic value? The second part, then, I think, to build on what Anna said, is, but then how do we try and take a fair share of that value to be a sustainable organization if we're a player in the archaeology sector as well? Those could be all kinds of things from revenue participation, pay what you can, all kinds of things are possible there. Licensing, contracting, philanthropic funding. But the key, I think, is to first figure out where do we want to create the value to begin with. What I see a lot of organizations try and do in every sector is that they jump straight to the value capture part and look at that and try and optimize that without really stepping back and saying, what benefit are we creating for the world in the biggest sense, and resolve a more fundamental strategic question as well. I hope that was helpful, Lisa. As a bit of
Yeah, no, that's incredibly interesting. And as you're speaking, I'm thinking about, this whole question of creating value, when it seems to be quite a black and white conversation in our sector, and yet archaeologists are also by and large really uncomfortable talking about money or value in a sophisticated way. And therefore the way that we extract value is extractive rather than thinking about different ways to benefit ourselves as a sector without having to just be extractive in that way. And I hope there are some archaeologists listening right now who will think about that provocation that Shareth has just said around archaeology for what. Please put your comments in the chat, because I wonder if anyone's ever really asked us the question in that way, other than having to compete for council funds against frontline delivery things like having your trash taken out, or free meals or whatever. We're always pitched as this competitor for funding in that way, and what benefit are we delivering back? And I think really deeply understanding some of those points that you just mentioned would help us get a little closer as a sector towards being able to challenge those kinds of really reductive statements. But it does boil down to other organizations out there in the archaeology sector thinking about that, the social and economic value, and how we can take a fair share of it without being shy, or needing to feel like we need to conceal it because things historically have been free. Nothing is free. It's all paid for somehow. But where's the regenerative cycle of that?
yeah.
I think that sits on the social outcomes.
At least if I can just add one thing before anybody wants to, it's just that what I've observed from our work together is that often a lot of what drives archaeology work can be around the compliance side. You have to do this because it's part of a new ... And I just think that is important, and the compliance part is a reality. It drives a lot of our current work. But as a sector, can we think about new sources of value that are not compliance driven, that are there because they genuinely create new ways of unlocking social value for communities at the core as well?
I would say there are huge parallels for the arts and cultural sector in particular in this sort of space. So that arts for arts value is a sort of thing that finds really it's very unfertile ground, let's say, for that kind of approach. And over the last decade or so, people have been working a lot more to the much broader sense of social value, whether that's in terms of education or skills and employability or health and well-being, and really thinking about what's their offer into those kind of spaces, and how is that deeply enmeshed and connected, so not separate from, but deeply enmeshed and connected and integrated into the existing work that they do. And they often talk, the concept of the triple bottom line, so rather than a double bottom line, but the triple bottom line, which in some sectors is people, profit, planet, but in the art sector was very much like people, profit, and art, and the vitality of the art that you were doing. So what you were just saying there very much speaks to the same kind of issues and challenges that they've had in the arts and cultural sector as well.
Yes, completely. And that's a really useful reflection. Brendan, let's hear it. Why do we need to be thinking about business and governance model, and what's currently not working, and why?
So I'll wrestle this down to the holes in the ground, shall I? I love where this conversation is going at the moment. This focus on value and the two ideas of capture and create. As well as Anna's point at the beginning about sunset and sunrise business models. And that really kind of underlines that this isn't a static situation. That might well have been a sunrise business model at one point, is rapidly aging and becoming a sunset business model. So it's really incumbent on us to see that and accept that change and work into it. And focusing on archaeology itself, there's around about 6,000 professional archaeologists in the UK, which is the population of a small market town like Barnard Castle, where I am now, and nearly 70% of those inhabitants all work in the commercial sector. So anything that triggers a planning condition, they're in front of that, evaluating, excavating, and so on. But when you sort of drill into the organisational and business models that underpin those organisations, you see a real troubling set of statistics. About half of those people employed are employed by charitable organisations or not-for-profit organisations, local authorities and universities, and straight-up charities. But then when you look at the output, of the industry as a whole and focus on its community engagement, its public archaeology, and its education, only 2.1% of our entire output can really be called charitable in any true sense. So there's this disconnect between our missions as organisations, being social value focused, public benefit organisations, and the business and operational models which make that work possible. It's as though we've picked a business model which kind of works against us trying to do real good in the world. And I think this is why we have to focus on these business models. Perhaps that was right as a business model some 40 years ago, in what we used to call the rescue revolution, when we had huge amounts of buildings, motorways were being done, and we had to quickly get into that archaeology. But it's not necessarily right for now. And I'm reminded of the quote by Audre Lorde, who said that the master's house can't be dismantled with the master's tools. Mm-hmm. To me, business models are a new set of tools that can help us create different kinds of values through the work that we do. And that's why I'm so fascinated by experimenting with them.
Yes, absolutely. And, I think that's kind of all three of those comments combined to set the stage for where we are right now. And I want to also sort of acknowledge that there's a comment in the chat from Sarah May, which is kind of it's a final comment on that, but also like helps to explain why we've kind of ended up here, which is that many archaeologists are unthinkingly committed to the idea of intrinsic value, and that value sits within the material they engage with. So the value is simply caring for material, not creating it. And, I think Anna's point about changing relationships with money, changing expectations in the workforce, Shara thinking about different ways of expressing value or new sources of value that are not just compliance driven is wrapped up in that, because there's a whole part of the sector that feels like our job in knowledge creation is just that we're creating. It's not to engage with it. It's not to broadcast it. It's not that's an actual, recognizable and truly meaningful beginning. And so I think, Brendan, what you've just said in acknowledging that the charitable outcomes of our business model are really just not being actualized is a really good way to explain why the model doesn't work, because the gears are grinding against each other. And will continue to, even more so as the inevitable march of more technology that is disruptive, again, referring to a comment rather than just sustaining. We're using technology. We can be seen as an innovative field because we use technology, but all it does is replicate what we already do. What we're not seeing is the responsiveness, for example, that you see with tech in the arts or tech in, other places like disaster zones and social entrepreneurship contexts where they're using it to do things better. So, I think that's also another important part of why we are stuck and basically ground to a halt in this current business model. So I want to say, all right, what are our choices? If that's where we are, where can we go? So the next question we've got is, what innovative business models could create more sustainable financial foundations for organizations? What is out there that's exciting? So Sheriff, why don't you take this one first?
Yeah, so I guess one of the things that has really struck me about our sector, having worked with the ventures over the past months, is that we are sandwiched really nicely between the commercial sector, for example, property developers, as an example, governments, groups like Natural England, large sort of government bodies like DEFRA, for example. We also have a lot of nonprofit activation, as you mentioned. So we have a lovely way to tap into each of those very distinct sectors. And I think what I really admire about the ventures is how with DV we've tried to be primarily a company, not go down fully a philanthropic route as well. To use a mixed funding model. I do wonder if we can start identifying who are the people that will really value our work. Each organization will have a different answer to that. But where can we add value, either in a constellation or a consortium or independently? Who are those people? And if we can articulate what is the business case for that group or that set of actors to engage with our work, that can really help us distill what that looks like. And we can start to think about how can we then work with those groups to advocate for that business case, show them the value we can create, and then look at taking a fair share of that value creation as well. So it's very specific. It's actually very grounded in our individual work as an organization, whatever we're doing in the sector. But I encourage us to just go through that process and think about that first.
Mm, mm. And do you see that working elsewhere? Are there other organizations that you've come across that have really got that balance down, that could be something that other archaeologists look to for new ways of doing things?
Yeah, so I had the pleasure of working with the B Corps movement. They're, for example, a large certification organization that tries to certifies companies for social impact. About 3% of our GDP now in the UK goes through that movement in just about 7 or 8 years. And we were looking at what the next mountain is to climb for them, post the 3% GDP. And I think what came out is that they had a very strong model to the certification, which is a bit like our compliance equivalent in archaeology, right? That some things you have to do, people want to do it. But what we've been looking at, I can't go into all the details, but how do we find additional revenue streams from really helping to change the rules of business overall, going more upstream? And that's often many organizations as they work, they start thinking, okay, we're making a good impact at this level. How do we get closer to the root cause? And what they realized was that actually, if we can change business mindsets around the playing field itself and shift those rules. That means like working with groups like pension funds, asset managers, governments, policymakers. So once we identified some of those new audiences, we could then look at what could be different business models of what value can we create from each of those
Mm.
groups for doing that. Then how do we take a fair slice of that as well?
Yeah, so that's very much speaks to, like, where are we as archaeologists limited by our own imaginations and what a business model could actually accomplish for us, outside of just always saying it's about compliance, it's about the rules, we have to color within the lines. Like, how could we potentially not color within the lines, and where would that create value? Brendan, what about you? What have you been? I mean, you're constantly reading books that I can barely understand the titles, let alone what's between the covers. So tell me, what's out there?
It is true. There's a pile next to the bed. Some of them will get read eventually.
Yeah.
Um, so
Techno-feudalism, for those of you who are listening, techno-feudalism was the latest. I don't even
great
know.
book. Great book. So I think this sustainability or resilience question would be a focus for me. When I think of the archaeology profession, the sector, I think of it as a kind of a single species like habitat, a monoculture, a conifer plantation that's led to huge growth over the decades. But it means that it's tremendously unresilient. It would only take a slight change to the planning system, and then it could all blow over. And we're about to go through another change to the planning system right now. So my question would be, how do we rewild the archaeology sector? How do we bring lots of different kinds of business models into play to create that resilience, both across the sector and within organizations themselves? We don't need, as organizations, to have one single dominant business model. We can play with a multitude so that they're there in case we really need them. And I'm particularly interested in crowd-based models because I think that there's an inner resilience to those models. So a charitable sector model might create income, create revenue, create profit on one hand, and then give it away on the other. Whereas a social enterprise model, a crowd-based model, looks at kind of a virtuous cycle. So for instance, in our own work, the more people that can find out about what we do, the more revenue flows into the social business, the more work that we can do, the more we can tell people about it, the more revenue flows in, and so on, and it builds consistently. And I think that's a really important thing to try and find a business model that both creates the value and change that you're making in the world through its profit generating activities. And that's a fundamental shift from where the dominant business model is in archaeology.
I like that. I feel 1,000 conference sessions have just been born with the title Rewilding Archaeology. But I would argue that we were never wild to begin with. And I think that's part of the problem. It's just been one way of doing things, which is bizarre for a profession, or I should say a discipline that encourages like really deep introspection and, innovation and ideas in the academic side of things. But none of that has sort of trickled through into how we actually do stuff. So I would say that maybe it's a wilding of the archaeology sector that you want to see first. And For those of you who have read Nature's Ghosts, it's a really fascinating exploration into what paleoenvironmental archaeology tells us about what humanity really has done and how much of rewilding is really rewilding or just our version of that. And what we think is right. So if you haven't read it, do have a look. I think we've probably shared it in previous newsletters. But and I would sort of say the same about your concept of rewilding the sector. Let's wild it first. And anyway, Anna, I know you're just going to, knock this one right out of the park. So what have you seen out there that's working?
Well, it's so interesting listening, because I was kind of thinking, actually, we've almost got the opposite problem in the cultural sector. It feels like pretty wild garden, and choosing the way to go to look for kind of alternative forms of value, or how do we realize that, or that, translate that from an idea into practice is kind of different. But just, I love the idea of upstream. I've definitely seen that happening as a sort of place to look for a value. The crowd-based models, there's a really nice kind of movement which straddles sort of community purpose and artistic and cultural sort of interest, like places like Bovi Paradiso, which is a community based organization that sort of bought out the asset and are gently sort of doing that up over time. Those kind of things are happening more and more in the cultural sector, and that community ownership is becoming really powerful and brilliant in place. So those kind of models exist. Diversification has been a big strategy for a really, really long time. So thinking about that sort of triple bottom line, it's also how many different forms of value can we supply, so we knit ourselves in to and that's often related to a place. So how do we knit ourselves in with a value to place that means that we can't be unknitted, we can't be taken out easily, has sort of been a strategy. There's a really interesting organization called Pegasus Opera, who started out as an organization that was trying to find opportunities for opera performances for people of global majority. And they realized that they were getting loads of phone calls about how do you find people of talent. And so they've set up Pegasus Talent. So that's actually a kind of commercial operation that supports their other work, but is also of huge benefit and value to the artists that want to find work. They now have an actual route into paid employment sort of through that. So this idea of who do we hand on from and who do we hand off to is another kind of area where people look for value. There's you talk about the kind of place in the ecology and partnerships. There's an organization called Diverse City that's all about equity and inclusion in culture. They have an interesting model where they retain their own existence, but they work really closely with a commercial company called Cirque Bijou. And so they have a charity working alongside a commercial company, and they both do their own thing, but they work together an awful lot. And that means that they essentially balance out the vulnerabilities of each other's kind of financial and business model, which I think is a really novel and different kind of approach. So there are lots of different strategies and lots of different ways people have gone about it. So there's loads of examples to mine if you need inspiration.
My question for you around the ones that you've just offered is, are they prioritizing their art, or are they prioritizing their financial stability first? Because when you were saying diversify, I'm thinking, what could archaeology do to diversify itself? Like, what would be the equivalent for an archaeology business? Let's say if they're working commercial, they're working to a compliance situation. So what's the opportunity for them? There's some obvious things that spring to mind, but then would that be driven by their desire to communicate archaeology, or would that be driven by their commercial need to bring in more income? And is it okay if it's just about the commercial side, if that's enabling the rest of the work? And so I wonder, how is that expressed through these business models,
Yeah, well, the hotspot is where you do both, actually. But I would say that the cultural sector is dominated by people who are brought to it through a values position. So they're doing it because they are passionate about culture and the value of culture. And it's very difficult for them to leave that behind. So pretty much everything they do is infused with this sense of of the art, and actually talking about money is sometimes quite difficult, but talking about providing social value is an awful lot easier.
Yeah.
And so you're looking at the reason I like these kind of models is that they found that beautiful balance of a commercial venture that fully supports their charitable mission and vision. Where you often see it is where people try, and that you end up with a kind of sense of internal competition between the profit driven activity and the charitable. And actually, the reason why these organizations are so interesting is they found the way to integrate it.
Yeah.
And the two things, so they're essentially part of the same value chain, but an extension of that value chain in some kind of way, rather than a two parallel tracks, or so it's about how to weave it together rather than run the tracks in the same direction, but not connected in any kind of way, if that makes sense.
I want to come back to that in a second, because I want to talk about a few more specific examples, but I want to talk about the role that governance plays in facilitating what you've just talked about. Because I also think that hand in hand with business models, it's pretty clear that the governance of the way the archaeology organizations are run, the bigger ones, let's say, is probably part of the reason why we're a little bit stuck. But I want to hear from Shareth, but also I wanted to also ask Brendan, first of all, are we getting our balance right at DV? And also, like, let's talk a little bit about what it takes to do that. What it takes to actually balance what we need to do versus what we exist to do. Let's say.
Great, that's very close to home.
Yes.
I don't know if I'm the best person to mark my own homework, but I'll give it a go. To me, it's very much a design challenge. It can fall into an either-or situation, but if you design your model carefully and are alive to all the upsides and downsides, then it's all part of the project. So in the instance of art, it's like part of the creating a model is an artistic practice as well. It's kind of the medium is the message idea. And I think that can be the same with archaeology. We can create a model of archaeology that creates both our intrinsic values, our contribution to knowledge, our shaping of our collective narrative as a species. But we can also have these instrumental outcomes by bringing people into the heart of the practice, as well as ensuring that it really has relevance for the spaces and places where it takes place. So the design aspect around the model and how it's delivered is as important. It is the work itself. So getting that absolutely right is the thing, and it's for others to judge whether we do it right ourselves, I think.
Okay, well, I'll let you sidestep it this time around.
Go on.
Just because it isn't fair to spring that on you. It is a really, what I can say to those who are listening is it's a constant calibration. Like, we have to tire kick every single decision, and ask ourselves whether or not it's headed for the true source of our legitimacy or driving us off course. And there have been opportunities that we've passed up to prevent that kind of drift. It's deadly. And then there have been others that we've taken on that aren't maybe immediately obvious for an organization like DV, but speak completely to the things that drive us and are our values. Yeah. So, Shareth, let's hear what you've got to say on this sort of balance between what it takes to be commercially successful and also walk the line with your social values. And, maybe after that, we can segue into talking about how governance factors into that.
Yeah, so I feel quite strongly, I think, building on what I think both Anna and Brendan said, that we should start with social value. It is a balancing act, but I think we have to start with the social piece first and look at what impact are we trying to create in the world, and what is our perspective on the problem we're trying to solve. So first of all, what's the problem itself, and then how do we see it differently? That grounds us in social value from the start. I think if you see that, then I think there is a lockstep between the social value we create and the commercial or the sustainability value, financial value that we want to generate to be a successful organization. I've seen sort of 5 trends, I think, in organizations around the business models that can help to make sure that really is a lockstep. One is that maybe these are questions to ask if you're running an archaeology organization or business or a nonprofit. First one is, are you helping people sleep better at night? So is your work helping not just to give a technical report about, let's say, a compliance particular area, a new development, but are you making really reducing risk and helping everyone feel better about what they're doing, able to move more comfortably? If so, there's probably value to create. Second question is, are you amplifying anyone's work? Are you adding value to anyone else's operations or programs or commercial work? If so, again, there's a source of value there. Third, is there an advisory element you could add? Are you able to add a new perspective, help someone else see things differently? If so, you've probably got an advisory arm to Anna's point about diversification. Fourth is there any opportunity to create networks and communities around what you do? Dig does this really, DV does this incredibly well, but is there a way to build a movement, a community around that? You could create value from helping that organization do that. And the last thing is there any scope for innovation? So can you help uncover any innovations that are not currently being surfaced in the archaeology space? Could you be effectively a lab for that? If so, again, you can pass those on to more mature organizations and create value. So just 5 questions that you might just want to ask yourself about sources of value overall. I think the role of governance, just very briefly, is to make sure that we don't drift off so fully off to commercial value and forget the social value to be so good. Whatever it is, it might be a board, it might be a advisory council, it might be people you just trust, a kitchen cabinet, whatever. If they can help us stay true to the social value, that can often be a powerful view on the governance fact.
Well, I've never been in a board meeting for any of the archaeological organizations who have them, but I really wonder if any of those conversations are about holding both the commercial and social priorities at the same time, or whether or not it's all bottom line driven, or trying to solutionize around resourcing issues, or any of that stuff. And I would be really interesting once the recording of this event, or even in the chat, makes its way through the sector, if anyone wanted to feed back where maybe some of those things are working and there's some oxygen in our boardrooms. Anyway, Anna, why don't you give us a culture sector perspective on that? Where do you think governance fits into like the abilities or disabilities of business models to grow?
Yeah, 100%. I definitely agree with the point about drift. And we often talk about a North Star and the ability to stay tuned to the North Star and use that as your navigational guide. And that is, would in the cultural sector would be a fundamental role of the board. I think I see it in people approaching it at least in 2 different ways, and there may be more, but one is around the a structural point. So sometimes the structural models aren't really fit for purpose. So you have seen people, organizations move, for example, from a charity to a kick. In fact, the B Corp model, I think, is super interesting and amazing. And it would be great to see people consider that as an option as well. But so first of all, to your point, Lisa, about oxygenating, sometimes the shift in the model in itself can provide that kind of oxygen or impetus, if you like, to get the engine cranked up and get moving around other stuff. The other dimension that people do often use is around the people. So who else, what fresh perspectives do we need to capture around the table? In the arts and cultural sector, that's not just about like, oh, have we got someone with, experience of the third sector or experience of successful commercial trading, but also what different lived experience have we got around the table that understands the value that we could potentially create? Have they got networks into that sort of area of value creation that could be really powerful? People have very much focused on lowering the average age of board and turning them sort of from the pale stale sort of model into really active, vibrant, connected, reflective, relevant, to their local communities. So there's been an awful lot of investment in time and effort in trying to think about and trying to be really open-minded about who can bring an amazing contribution into those kind of discussions. And then that, again, how do we organize ourselves once we're a group to add value? If there's people out there who do have boards, certainly in the cultural sector, often encountering a board meeting is like a groan moment rather than I'm really excited about the conversation that we're going to have. And so, there's an awful lot of work about how to make that a dialogue, how to point people in the direction of the feedback that you really want and that would be really useful. How do we set up the dynamic of a meeting so that we've got space for strategy? That often gets squeezed out, especially in a compliance oriented area of work. Some of those bigger conversations about value and purpose can get squeezed out.
Yes, totally. So maybe for anyone listening who's in that kind of organization with a board, maybe the first step towards achieving any kind of change is to think about how you're approaching your board meetings. It could be an easy first step to sort of refresh your mission rather than having to refresh your whole board, which, as we know from recent events in large national museums, can also go the wrong way. That it could be just around refreshing the mission or even the agenda of the meeting that you go into every day, or saying if social value isn't on here as much as our financial well-being, how come it isn't, especially if they're a charity. And I would also say that the governance is a really tricky one because it is often just seen as like hygiene. You brush your teeth so you have a board, or something like that. And at DV, we've chosen not to take that route, although we do work with a lot of external advisors, and some of them are with us all long term, and some we pick up and put down around our needs. But I remember from the fundraising that I used to do in a previous life that it's often seen as a reward for time served. And I think we need to find a new way to respect that sort of generational experience and not allow it to be sidelined as pale and stale or not as valuable as the young viewpoint coming. And I just don't think that the semantics around it are welcoming that experience. And so I think that's true for a lot of boards, let's say in archaeology, and how they see their own responsibilities to those boards. Brendan, do you have any further reflections on the governance side of things?
Yeah, absolutely. So, governance, as you said, it's almost anathema to us as social entrepreneurs, particularly when we began. We recognized that many of our colleagues, and particularly at CEO level, spent an inordinate amount of their time just managing their boards. And this, in a day-to-day rough and tumble of work life is, can be okay. But when your organization is transforming from one of those sunrise bodies to a sunset body, then that blocker to change that's needed, that's existential, can be absolutely, it can just cut the knees off. So when we set Dig Ventures up, we chose not to do that. Now, I recognise that what we've also jettisoned in that is, to some extent, a check and balance, particularly around innovation. History is peppered with great innovations that turned out to have unintended consequences that were detrimental to any kind of value or society. So how do we manage that process without a kind of a governance body? And we do that through data. We collect data around our innovations at every single step. We have a theory of change, of the work that we do, the change that we're making in the world, who we're making it for. We have a set of evidential standards that shows the degree to which we're making that change. And we publish that regularly around specific projects, around the organization itself periodically. So having that to me is a check and a balance in and of itself. Now, I recognize that we're a certain scale, and that wouldn't be right for a national or what have you. But if you can get both, if you can have that social entrepreneurial drive enabled by a system of governance, as well as a broader check and balance, then I think that's the sweet spot.
Yeah. I think it has to start with a genuine desire, to see both and to be differently. And, if it's articulating because all of a sudden the Social Value Act is a lot more important, I mean, that's fine too. As long as it goes to a good place, it can pretty much start anywhere, especially for those orgs that really are sort of tied to the compliance situation.
One thing I'd say, guys, on this one is that I've found often that if we're a leader of an organization or part of the leadership team, how we sort of orientate our board and give them purpose can make a big difference. So if we tend to focus them on compliance and it can end up being micromanagement in order to time, Brendan, can happen. But if we can create more, I do a lot of work with boards and the executive teams to build a better trust relationship where there's more space for the executives to run the short, medium term and work with the board on the long term. It's got to be executive led still. They're closest to it. They've got the expertise, the focus. But I think having someone to step back with and think about that long term, our hand direction can be very useful. So, yeah, again, I think it's not, we can redefine the boundaries between what the board and what an executive team does. And I'd encourage us to be quite intentional about what those boundaries are and who does what, and have an honest conversation about what really makes the most sense in your context.
Mm. If I one very quick thing, I in the same way that Brendan was talking about the design piece, like is the work, governance is the work. Like, you know, especially thinking about what's our legacy, generational legacy. What are we handing on here to the people who are coming through? What's the opportunity for them well into the future? Then that is exactly the place where it can work really, really powerfully, is in those governance moments and organizations, and that is really, really part of the work, definitely.
So speaking of the work, you know, for those that will be watching this who are like, okay, but what can I do like tomorrow? You know, we're trying to focus trends as much as we can on these really big ideas, but also helping people to maybe take the very first baby step next. You know, what would be a recommendation from each of you? Like, what would you do tomorrow if you were someone who had seen this and then wanted to go try to start the process somewhere? Brendan, why don't you take this one first?
Right. So I'm always drawn to Simon Sinek's golden circle idea, that kind of start with why. You know, we need, as organizations, as practitioners, as individuals, really be honest and drill into that as the kind of first starting place. Simon Sinek says people don't buy what you do, they buy why you do it. So why are we doing what we do? And then see how that can be modeled into different areas, different models. You know, there's nothing new under the sun. I think the latest, most recent business model, I'm fed to be corrected by the rest of the panel here, but I think it might be about 250 years old, subscription. The question isn't like, you know, the newest thing, it's how the old thing can be, you know, refocused in a new way. And in order to do that, you need to have absolute surety about what you stand for, the change you make in the world, and why you make that change. So to me, it all begins with why.
Excellent. Who's next? Shareth?
I want to build on what Ben said really beautifully, actually. So I think this idea that we can unlock creativity, you know, business models, we tend to think of our financial analysts, accountants. That's not really what we're talking about. I think before we get to those, that is the final step. But actually the bigger thing is, you know, again, who do we really create value for the world and why? And to Ben's point, and how can we try to have a fair share of that value? That almost always starts by stepping back and saying, how do we see the world differently from others, the sector differently? What unique role can we play? And building everything around that. So there's a wonderful line of alignment that can happen around what we do and really having impact and social value with being robust financially. That's kind of basically a business model there.
Yeah, and I think if you're someone listening to this on the recording or live, and you work in one of the commercial units, who I know are all trying really hard to do better and do more, you know, around the social value side of archaeology, maybe ask someone tomorrow whether or not that's on the next board agenda, and if not, why not? That might be a really good way to take a next step. You know, Anna, what are your thoughts?
Well, I definitely don't disagree with the why. I definitely don't disagree with the who, because I think the who is really important. Often just asking people, I find it's bizarre how reticent, certainly in the cultural sector, people are about just asking people. I'm like, what do you know, you are our community on our doorstep. What value, what do you need? And you can open up some amazing conversations just by asking that simple question and really listening to what people say. I think maybe that's the hard part, is deep listening to what people say. I would also say, in my experience, like sometimes even just the talk of like what is a business model can be really scary. And just you talked about creativity. I'd say almost there's an attitude of play towards understanding what is our business model. Can you draw it? Can you make it out of a model? Can you put some pieces on a table and arrange them in some kind of way that describes for you what your business model is? Because the more comfortable you feel about knowing your own model, then the more you can take out a piece and move it around and practice that re-engineering kind of activity. So you would maybe expect me to say that because I come from the cultural sector and we do an awful lot of play. Maybe for you it's a table of artifacts, and arrange the artifacts or layers or whatever is right for you. But there's something about starting to try and describe your own model in your own terms and not worry about all the jargonese and everything that you can read sort of about it, but trying to feel comfortable in your own skin, and then you can move on to what do I want to change out of this model that is holding us back. So play would be my suggestion.
Excellent. And also a very timely opportunity for me to mention, we have a whole DV trend session on play coming up towards the end of the year. And on our team, it would be Lego. We would be required to build anything out of Lego. Yeah, that's a really interesting one. Permission to fail, permission to play, all of those things are really important in leadership. And, in previous events in DV Trends, we had a conversation with some leaders in the sector who kind of acknowledged that we don't really have permission to fail, and we don't have permission to play because our attitude to leadership in the sector is very managerial, let's say, rather than, that sort of creating space version that comes along with people who are thinking about leadership. So, they are all interlinked, really. And, someone has to be willing to give it a try and to fail, and to be open about that as well. Although, when you have big organizations with hundreds of people, failing is not really an option, but equally, there's no room right now for experimentation either. And I think a reflection on what all of you have said is one of our realities is this linkage, this financial dependence that we have on the compliance side of our business. And that is having a wobble right now, because who knows what's coming down the pike. And there will be a lot of scrambling depending, one way or the other. And I hope this time around the sector takes time to learn from that, really, and make itself a little bit less dependent, because I think that's absolutely essential at this point. There are a couple questions. We're going to move on to some questions and further discussion before we wrap up. One from Sarah May, who asked whether or not we invited any of the orgs with boards to join us today, because it would be good to understand their experience of the North Star. Again, is it an assumed thing as long as they are doing archaeology? And what I wanted to say is everyone's invited. I would love it if some of the leadership from across the sector would start to drop into these and share, their perspectives. It really is important. I don't think we have any of them with us today. So what I would say back to Sarah is, if she wants to understand those experiences with the North Star idea, let's do a conference session. Let's get out there and keep talking about this stuff and not let it drop. Certainly DV Trends is meant as a starting point and not as a finishing point. And then we've got one here, it looks like from PETA. Has Dig Ventures noticed a drop in crowdsourced / citizen science participation due to the current economic situation, with most people having less money to spend? So Brendan, I think that's one for you.
No, quite the opposite. In fact, our crowdfunding income has grown year on year since we began. But as an example of that, Lindisfarne is our last year there, our 10th year digging. So we put our crowdfunding total up to £80,000, which is going to cover extra weeks and radiocarbon dates and all kinds of analysis level tasks. We thought that would be a real stretch for us, and that closed within an hour and hit 140% by the end of the day. So, we're in a whole different way. The question's also underneath the question is ideas about inclusion and participation. Our stats around that is this is still an extremely diverse audience, much more diverse than potentially the free models of archaeology. So it's really about changing how you do, finding those new forms of income and testing those assumptions, because they're not always correct.
Yes, and so much of the way we relate to audiences, let's say in archaeology, is around what we provide needing to be free. Because for what, for years and years and years, it was the preserve of the upper classes, and then it was, subsidized by the NLHF and others. That participation end of things was subsidized, and the whole should it be free question has really paralyzed our ability to move forward and interacting as a sector with our audiences in this way. So really, the second part of the answer to PETA is, or PETA, I'm sorry if I'm mispronouncing your name, is really that, it's not about the money. It's never been about the money. And, we've not been able to move the needle on the whole crowdfunding conversation for the last decade because our sector is so focused on the money. And the people who aren't focused on the money are the participants, because the value exchange that they're getting out of interacting with DV is completely different. And we understand what that is very well because we speak to them and we know them deeply. And that knowledge goes back into the model and feeds then what other opportunities we offer, how we communicate about what we're doing, and how the organization actually decides to grow is completely in tandem with that stuff. And I, for one, would love to see other archaeology organizations starting to harness that in a different way. That's some of the work we're doing with Sheriff, as well as what's gonna change for us now that we're also working in nature recovery, where there's a whole new set of people, a whole new set of ambitions and desires and fears and realities, as we're presented with lots of different impacts. So I think that's going to bring our conversation to a close. Thank you to all the panelists. We have a ton of resources to send out along with the recording, so do keep your eyes peeled for that. And we will let you guys know where to find Sheriff and Anna online if you wanted to pick up with them particularly. And you all know where to find Brendan because you can never shut DV off. We are going to be having another event as yet to be scheduled. It will be in the next couple of months. Very timely, very exciting around archaeology and AI. It's going to be a little bit different, though. It's beyond workflow. So this isn't just about how to use ChatGPT to ask questions or to write your board minutes or to do whatever. This is thinking about AI in a much more holistic way. And if you want to find out more about that event, click on the little QR code there below. Join the DV Trends newsletter where you'll receive information about that, as well as lots of cool stuff around what we're reading, listening to, seeing, thinking, and where all the ideas come from. So thanks so much to everybody who joined us live, and to our fantastic panelists. It's been excellent speaking to you guys.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, guys. Really nice to catch you. Thank you.